From icy fjords to sunlit shores of Byzantium, a storm of steel and sail reshaped the medieval world. The Vikings, farmers turned raiders, rose from Scandinavia's rugged coasts to carve their names into history with axe and oar. They plundered monasteries, traded across empires, and founded kingdoms where none had stood before. Yet beneath the fury of their raids lay artistry, law, and exploration that reached the edges of the known world. From terror to transformation, the Viking Age was not an age of darkness. It was the spark that ignited a new Europe from the ashes of the old. The sea is never still in the north. It moves like a living thing, breathing against the rocks, pulling at the kelp that clings to the shore. On a grey morning, a young man stands knee-deep in the surf, hands numb as he works a net heavy with herring. Behind him, the cliffs rise sharp and black, crowned with pine and mist. His village lies above the cove. Half a dozen turf-roofed houses crouched against the wind, smoke trailing sideways from their holes. It is a hard place, but it is the only world he knows. When he looks out across the grey expanse, he sees no edge, no border, only the heaving plain of water that has always been there. The old men say it leads to other lands, where the sun burns longer and the earth gives grain without stones. They speak of traders who come from the south with bright cloth and silver coins, of ships built by people who live behind walls of wood and prayer. The young man listens, but in his chest there is something older than curiosity. It is hunger, the restlessness of a people born between the forest and the sea. What do you think drives people to leave the only world they've ever known? In this land, the earth offers little, and the sky offers less. The summers are brief and bright as a flame, the winters long enough to turn memory to dream. Yet hardship breeds a fierce intimacy. Families bind together in tight knots of kinship, tracing their bloodlines back through jarls and warriors, through names carried in song. Honor is not a word here. It is breath itself, the invisible measure of worth. A man without kin or without courage is a man already dead. Across the inlets of Norway, through the deep forests of Sweden, and along the flat coasts of Denmark, such villages cling to the edges of survival. Each is ruled by a chieftain, a jarl whose wealth is counted in cattle, ships, and men willing to fight beneath his banner. Power shifts not through laws, but through gifts. Rings, weapons, mead shared in smoky halls where poets praise the generous and scorn the weak. This was the world before kings, before Christ, before conquest, the twilight before a storm. In the long nights, when the fire crackles and the snow seals the doors, the skalds speak of gods who once shaped the world from the bones of a giant. They tell of Odin, the one-eyed wanderer who traded sight for wisdom, of Thor, whose hammer keeps the frost giants at bay, of Freya, who rides to battle and chooses half the slain. To the Northmen, these are not distant deities, but kin. Their world is alive with spirits that dwell in rock and tree, wave and wind. To live is to struggle against the endless turning of fate, and to die well is to earn a place in Valhalla, where the brave feast and fight forever. This belief does not comfort, it binds. Every oath sworn, every raid begun, every blade drawn carries the weight of destiny. Even the simplest acts, mending a net, setting a keel, lighting a fire, belong to a rhythm older than memory. Fate is not a chain, but a current, pulling all men toward the same unseen horizon. In such a world, mastery of the sea is not choice, but necessity. The ocean is both enemy and road. Along its narrow fjords, men learned to read the wind as others read scripture. They hollowed oak trunks into sleek hulls, fastened their planks with iron nails, and sealed the seams with tar and wool. The clinker-built ship was their greatest art, a living creature of wood and will, light enough to drag overland, strong enough to face the open sea. Each voyage began with the pounding of hammers, the smell of pine pitch, and the murmur of prayers to the gods of tide and storm. At first, their journeys were short, across the Skagerrak to the markets of Frisia, or east toward the amber shores of the Baltic. They traded furs, walrus ivory, and iron for wine, glass, and silver. Yet every voyage stretched the map of their world a little further. The sea taught them boldness, and boldness soon became a creed. Among these early sailors, there were already whispers of new ventures. Some spoke of the rich monasteries across the western sea, places filled with gold, guarded only by men in robes who knew no weapon but prayer. Others looked east to the lands beyond the forests, where rivers led to cities said to gleam with domes and incense. But for now, their ambitions were small: to survive another winter, to return with something worth boasting of. Still, the signs of change were gathering. Populations swelled, pressing against the limits of arable land. Sons without inheritance turned restless, their futures trapped behind the walls of their fathers' halls. Iron grew plentiful, weapons more deadly. The hunger that once drove men to trade now began to whisper of plunder. In the south, the Carolingian Empire was rising, its armies baptized in the name of a new god. The Franks built roads and fortresses, united under a single cross. To the Northmen, such order seemed unnatural, a web that bound men in obedience. They lived by older rules: courage, cunning, and kin. To bow to an unseen master was to invite shame. And yet, in the flicker of their hearths, stories of southern silver gleamed brighter with each telling. The first raids were not yet the work of nations, but of bands, small crews of a few dozen men, drawn from neighboring villages. They set sail in the summer, striking swift and vanishing before dawn. Monasteries made easy prey, isolated, filled with treasures, defended only by faith. Their ships left no warning, their attacks no pattern. They were not yet the scourge of Europe, but their legend had begun to stir. No man could have foreseen how far it would reach. In a world still divided by river and hill, these scattered northern tribes were bound by something deeper than kin. It was the sea itself, an endless mirror of hunger and possibility that made them one. Every storm that broke their ships taught them resilience. Every voyage that failed taught them cunning. Theirs was a civilization tempered by hardship, sharpened by distance and forged by wind. One evening, as the sun sank blood-red over the fjord, the young man from the shore watched gulls circle above the tide. Behind him, the hall glowed with firelight, voices rising in laughter and song. Below, his father's ship rested on the sand, its carved prow shaped like a serpent poised to strike. The air smelled of pine smoke and salt. He could not know that within a generation, ships like his father's would carry their people across half the known world, nor that their name, once whispered only along the fjords, would soon make empires tremble. In the year 793 AD, the sea itself seemed to roar with omen. From the grey horizon came longships under black sails. They fell upon the holy island of Lindisfarne with fire and iron, tearing through the quiet of prayer with the fury of gods unbound. Monks fled, silver melted, and Europe awoke to a terror it would never forget. The Northmen had arrived, and the world would never be the same again. The same winds that bent the pines along Norway's coast carried news farther than any rider. Across the narrow sea, traders returned with stories of soft lands and easy wealth. In the markets of Ribe and Hedeby, Voices from Frisia, Saxony, and the Frankish towns mingled over piles of furs and ingots. One could hear the clatter of scales, the hiss of tallow lamps, the clink of silver coins struck with foreign kings' faces. For the Northmen, such markets were not merely places of barter, they were glimpses of another order of life, one measured in silver rather than blood. Yet the silver that flowed northward did more than enrich a few chieftains. It unsettled the balance of their world. Where gifts had once sealed loyalty, now coin did. Warriors who once fought for kin began to fight for pay, and wealth, like the sea, eroded the old boundaries. Jarls who mastered the art of exchange found their halls swelling with men eager for plunder as much as for honor. The same ships that carried amber and hides soon learned to carry swords. Beyond Denmark's shallow coasts stretched a geography made for restless hands. To the west lay the wide North Sea, to the east the calm Baltic, with its web of rivers leading deep into the continent. Between them lay the Skagerrak and Kattegat, those storm-torn gateways through which every voyage must pass. Navigating them was a test of nerve and craft. The longships' shallow keels allowed them to slip through inlets where deeper vessels would founder. Their overlapping planks flexed like muscle against the waves. Such design was born not of theory, but of survival, perfected in the shipyards of generations who had no other road than water. As the years turned, these sailors began to think not just of reaching markets, but of choosing them. A trader who could sail to Dorestad might as easily arrive armed. Between trade and raid lay only intention, and hunger often decided which prevailed. A storm might drive a merchant to take what the wind denied him. A failed harvest might make plunder seem providence. In the language of the North, there was no shame in it. Fortune favored the bold, and the bold built legends. In the west, the islands of Britain drew their gaze. There, monasteries rose like lighthouses of faith amid a sea of pagan tribes. Their towers gleamed with gilded crosses, their treasuries filled with chalices, relics, and books bound in precious metal. To men who worshipped the hammer and the spear, these were offerings waiting to be claimed. The monks prayed to a god who turned the other cheek. The Northmen believed in gods who struck back. It was an unequal conversation, and only one side spoke with iron. Meanwhile, the inland world was changing. Population grew faster than the land could yield. Forests receded under the axe, and each generation divided its inheritance thinner. Younger sons, stripped of fields and herds, turned to the sea for promise. What began as necessity hardened into custom. A man's worth measured not by what he owned, but by what he dared to take. When the snows melted and the rivers opened, shipyards came alive with hammering. Each plank laid, each rivet driven, was a wager against fate. In one such yard near the Limfjord, a chieftain named Hrolf stood over the skeleton of a new ship. Its prow curved into the head of a dragon. Its sides flared like wings. Around him, his men worked in silence, save for the rhythm of mallets. Hrolf had traded in Frisia the year before, and returned with tales of unguarded coasts, fat herds, and soft monasteries whose bells rang for peace. That summer, he gathered a crew of 30, farmers' sons, exiles, wanderers, and swore them to secrecy. Their first voyage would not be for trade. Across the Baltic, others thought the same. Swedish crews struck south toward the Slavic lands, collecting tribute in furs and slaves. Norwegian bands tested the northern isles of Britain, probing their monasteries for weakness. Each raid taught them something: the weight of foreign swords, the reach of tides, the terror that rumor could breed. When survivors spoke of sea wolves who came with the dawn, they gave the raiders their greatest weapon: Fear. Fear travelled faster than any ship. By the time the sails appeared again on the horizon, their legend had already arrived. In taverns and churches from Kent to Flanders, men whispered of devils who came from the sea, pale as ghosts and merciless as winter. The term Northmen became a prayer and a curse alike. To the raiders, it was music. As raids multiplied, so did the need for order. Crews grew into fleets. Temporary camps became winter settlements. Along Ireland's coasts, harbours like Dublin and Waterford took root, half camp, half market. There, captured goods were traded back into the very networks they had been stolen from. The line between pirate and merchant blurred until none could tell the difference. But before such colonies could form, there had to be a spark, a moment when all the hunger, craft, and belief of the North erupted into history. It came not from kings or councils, but from a single decision: to strike a holy place whose peace was guarded only by faith. Lindisfarne was a small island off Northumbria's coast, home to monks who copied scripture and tended sheep. To the Northmen, it was simply visible from the sea. On a morning in early summer, sails appeared beyond the mist. The islanders heard the gulls first, then the low drum of oars. What followed would be remembered for centuries: iron against flesh, flame against parchment. The abbey's bells rang once, then fell silent beneath the roar of waves. The attackers took silver, gold, and captives. They left behind a world changed. For the monks who survived, it was apocalypse. For the raiders, it was revelation. They had crossed not only water, but a boundary of imagination. The gods of the north had proven stronger than the god of the south, or so it seemed. Word of their success spread faster than wind through the fjords. Each tale grew with the telling, ships returning laden with treasure, warriors welcomed as heroes, skalds singing their names beside the fire. Within months, other chieftains followed. The Western Isles burned, river mouths filled with foreign sails. Yet amid the blood and glory, a new pattern was taking shape. Raiding had begun as adventure. It was becoming a system. Camps turned to ports. Alliances formed between rival jarls, and the economy of violence took root. Silver flowed north in rivers, feeding the same hunger that had birthed it. Back in his hall, Hrolf set the plunder from Lindisfarne before his men. A gilded cross, a chest of coins, a monk's illuminated book whose letters shone like jewels. He could not read it, but he saw in its pages a reflection of his own ambition, a story waiting to be rewritten in steel. Outside, the wind howled through the fjord, and the ship that had carried him there rested ready for another voyage. In the decades to come, such men would reshape the map of the known world. Yet in that first moment, they thought only of return, of wealth, of fame that would outlast the body. The sea had given them passage, the gods permission. The age of farmers and fishermen was over. The age of the Northmen had begun. Smoke still hung over the island when the raiders pulled their oars and turned homeward. Behind them, Lindisfarne burned like a coal against the grey sea. The monks' cries had faded into the wind, leaving only the slap of waves against the hull. The men rowed in silence, faces smeared with ash, silver spilling from chests between their feet. None spoke of sin or mercy. They had looked upon another world and found it soft. The gods, they believed, had smiled. By the time their ships reached the fjords, the tale had grown teeth. Villages gathered on the shore to watch the returning sails, children clinging to their mothers' skirts as the men waded ashore with spoils glittering in their arms. In the longhouse that night, torches flared and voices rose. Every coin, every jewel, every scrap of gold was proof that the South was rich, unguarded, and waiting. In that hall, beneath the carved beams and drifting smoke, the future was decided without plan or law. Others would go. The next summer, more ships left the coast. Some steered for Ireland, others for the monasteries of Northumbria and the coasts of Francia. Where the first raid had been a whisper, the second was a chorus. The sea that once carried merchants now bore predators. Monks who heard the sound of oars no longer prayed for calm weather. They prayed for deliverance. Fear became their greatest ally. Before the Northmen arrived, terror went ahead of them like a herald. Rumor described their ships as dragons, their sails black as night. To the monks and peasants of the south, they were creatures out of prophecy, children of the serpent from Revelation, come to punish a faith grown proud. The chroniclers would later call them the fury of the Northmen, as if the wind itself had turned against Christendom. For the raiders, that fear was a weapon more precious than iron. Their numbers were small, their ships fragile, their strength scattered among rival jarls. Yet wherever they struck, resistance crumbled. They appeared where no army could march, up rivers, through marshes, across shallow bays. When danger rose, they vanished, rowing with the tide. To fight them was to fight smoke and water. In one summer, a fleet of Danish ships descended upon the island of Iona, burning the abbey and killing every monk they found. Another struck Jarrow, another the coasts of Aquitaine. The Frankish king sent letters of outrage to his bishops, ordering prayers against the heathen scourge. He raised fleets to patrol the rivers, but the sea was too wide, and the north too many. The empire that had crushed the Saxons found itself helpless before fishermen turned pirates. Among those who rose to fame in this new world of war was a man the Skalds called Ragnar, son of Sigurd. Whether one man or many, his name became legend. He was said to have sailed with black sails, to have stormed Paris, to have married kings' daughters and defied their fathers. His sons, Bjorn Ironside, Ivar the Boneless, Ubbe, would later carry that legend like a torch. In their stories, the raids ceased to be crime or hunger. They became destiny. But legend alone could not feed a people. Behind every raid lay a deeper change. The old ways of barter gave way to an economy of silver and slaves. The longships returned not only with gold chalices, but with captives, scribes, craftsmen, monks, sold in the markets of Rebe and Hedeby. What had begun as plunder became industry. Halls grew larger, jarls richer, poets louder. Each victory financed the next. On the western shores of Ireland, the raiders found not only prey, but opportunity. The island's warring kingdoms were divided by old grudges, and its coasts offered natural harbours. There, the Northmen built their first footholds. They came in summer to raid and in winter to trade, until no one could tell the seasons apart. Dublin rose first, a town of tents and timber, where silver changed hands faster than words. Waterford followed, then Limerick, a chain of outposts that would soon become cities. In these settlements, Norsemen took local wives, learned new tongues, and raised children who called both lands home. They became something different from what they had been. Neither wholly Viking nor wholly Celt. In their veins ran the beginnings of a hybrid world. The Norse Gaels, sea-born and iron-handed. Meanwhile, in Francia, the Carolingian rulers tried to buy peace. Gold flowed north as swiftly as it had once flowed south. The payments were called Dangeld, money for the Danes, a ransom paid by kings to those they could not defeat. Some jarls took it as tribute, Others saw it as invitation. Each coin was a promise of weakness, each treaty a reason to return. Still, not every voyage ended in triumph. The sea claimed as many as it spared. Storms shattered fleets, reefs tore hulls to splinters, hunger and disease thinned the ranks. Yet even disaster became legend. When a ship went down, the survivors swore it was Odin himself who chose the drowned for his haul. The sagas that grew from their journeys were not laments, but testaments. To die on land was to vanish. To die at sea was to be remembered. Back home, the villages of the fjords changed shape. Once quiet coves filled with ship frames, smithies rang through the night. A generation had grown up knowing no world but this one, a life measured in voyages. Boys born in the year of Lindisfarne were now men, restless and unafraid. The gods of their fathers still watched from the high seats of Asgard, but the suns had given them new altars, prows carved with dragons, decks slick with salt and blood. As the 840s dawned, the raids no longer came from scattered bands, but from fleets of dozens, even hundreds of ships. They sailed under banners, led by jarls whose names carried authority from the fjords to the channel. Some stayed for seasons, building encampments along river mouths, marrying the daughters of local lords. The line between invader and ruler grew thin. What had begun as chaos was hardening into empire. And yet, amid their triumph, a strange transformation took hold. The more they plundered, the more they learned the ways of those they robbed. They took not only gold, but craftsmen, not only captives, but customs. They learned to mint coins, to write contracts, to rule as kings rather than chieftains. The same fire that burned monasteries now lit the foundations of new towns. In one of those towns, a skald sang beside the fire, his voice rising above the noise of the feast. He told of the first raid, of the island that burned, of the gods who had guided their oars. The men listened, drunk on mead and memory, and laughed at the fear they inspired. Outside, the tide was turning. Tomorrow they would sail again, for there was no boundary left that could hold them. The age of the raid had become the age of the North. By the middle of the 9th century, the fury of the North had become a season, as regular as the harvest. When spring broke the ice, the first sails appeared on the horizon. Monks and peasants alike learned to measure the year not by feasts or moons, but by raids. Bells that once called to prayer now tolled for warning. Across the coasts of Ireland, Britain, and Francia, towers rose beside abbeys, walls thickened, and kings learned the price of neglect. But no wall could hold forever. The sea was an open road, and the Northmen knew every hidden inlet, every river mouth where the tide ran deep. Their ships were like shadows, arriving, vanishing, and returning where least expected. The very swiftness that had once made them raiders was now turning them into conquerors. The most feared among them were the sons of Ragnar. Whether he had truly lived or was a tapestry woven from 100 captains' deeds, his name gave shape to ambition. His sons carried it as a banner. Ivar the Boneless, cunning and cruel. Bjorn Ironside, the relentless seafarer. Uber, the steady hand. Each led fleets that darkened the seas between the Shetlands and the Seine. Their raids were no longer sudden strikes but campaigns, planned with patience and fought with purpose. In Ireland, Norse strongholds multiplied. Dublin, once a cluster of tents and hides, became a market of timber halls and wharves crowded with goods from every shore. Frankish wine, Baltic amber, English slaves. The Norse Gael lords who ruled there held power through trade as much as war. Their ships served as both merchant fleets and warbands. Their silver, minted with foreign faces, became the new language of dominion. The sea connected them all, a single empire without borders, bound by tide and courage. Meanwhile, the coasts of Francia learned the rhythm of invasion. The great rivers, the Seine, the Loire, the Garonne, were highways straight into the heart of the realm. From their decks, the Northmen could see spires of cities once thought untouchable. They struck Rouen, Nantes, Bordeaux, and even Paris itself. In 845, a fleet said to be led by Ragnar sailed up the Seine and besieged the city. The walls held, but the king, Charles the Bald, chose ransom over ruin. He paid the raiders £7,000 of silver to depart. The gesture, meant as mercy, became invitation. Every coin carried north told its own story. It glimmered in the torchlight of halls in Denmark and Norway, passed from hand to hand as proof that the world beyond their fjords could be conquered with oars. Poets turned silver into song. Young men turned song into vows. Each generation that followed grew bolder, better armed, more organized. What had begun as hunger had become a vocation. Yet not all who sailed sought only plunder. Some saw in the fertile valleys and mild winters of the south a life worth claiming. They began to build winter camps that became permanent. In Northumbria, in East Anglia, in Ireland and Scotland, the Norse dug their roots into the soil of their enemies. Farmers followed the warriors, and families followed the farmers. Intermarriage blurred the lines between invader and native until even language began to shift. The children born in these settlements carried two worlds in their speech: Norse and Saxon, pagan and Christian, sea and soil. In the markets of these new towns, one could hear half a dozen tongues at once. A trader from Hedeby haggled in broken Gaelic over amber beads. A monk from York sold manuscripts to men who could not read them but admired the art. The Northmen were learning the economy of peace, not through piety, but through profit. Still, violence was never far. Rival bands fought for territory, and alliances were as fickle as wind. When a fleet gathered for war, it was less an army than a confederation of ambition. Every jarl was a king on his own deck, every oar a declaration of will. Leadership depended on charisma, not birth. A man could rise from obscurity if he had courage, cunning, and luck. The sagas remembered such men more than any crown. Among them was a young warrior known as Halfdan, said to be another of Ragnar's sons. He landed in Northumbria and claimed the city of York. There he ruled not as a foreign tyrant, but as a pragmatic lord, collecting taxes, enforcing laws, and minting coins bearing his own name. To his followers, it was victory. To his subjects, survival. Under his rule, the city became a symbol of what the Viking Age was becoming: part raider, part ruler, part merchant. The Christian chroniclers could not understand it. How could heathens who burned churches also build them anew? How could men who worshipped Thor and Odin trade peacefully with monks and scribes? Yet that was the paradox of the Northmen. They did not come to destroy civilization. They came to join it on their own terms. Their violence was a doorway through which culture itself began to pass. While the English and Franks struggled to repel them, the raiders turned their eyes inward. Competition for fame grew fierce. Feuds flared between rival jarls. In Norway, small kingdoms clashed for dominance. In Denmark, power began to concentrate under a single banner. The Vikings were learning not only how to raid others, but how to rule themselves. By the late 840s, their world was changing faster than they could have imagined. The first generation of raiders, the men who had seen Lindisfarne burn, were growing old. Their sons no longer remembered a life before silver, before sails, before conquest. The The sea had given them everything and demanded everything in return. The gods of their ancestors were still invoked in battle, but now crosses appeared beside hammers, prayers beside oaths. The faith of the South, carried north by slaves and traders, began to take root even among those who once mocked it. And yet, for all the change, the old hunger endured. In the longhouses of Norway and Denmark, when the winter storms howled and the fire smoked against the rafters, the skalds still sang of glory, of distant shores, of men who refused to die quietly. The stories of Ragnar's sons were told beside those of Thor and Odin, woven together until history and myth became one. From these tales, a new identity emerged. They were no longer merely farmers who fought, nor outcasts driven by need. They were something larger, Vikings, a word that no longer meant place but purpose. It was not where they came from, but what they did. To go a Viking was to embrace the sea, to seek fortune and fame, to live by the edge of the blade and the mercy of the wind. On a calm night in Dublin, a trader from the east lifted a cup of wine and looked across the harbour. Ships lay at anchor, their prows shaped like beasts, their sails furled. The air smelled of tar and salt. Around him, laughter and song echoed from the taverns, mingling with the crash of waves. He thought of home, of forests, snow, and silence, and knew he would not return. The north was no longer a place. It was a memory carried on the sea. So the age of raiding ended not with defeat, but with transformation. The Northmen had turned from shadows into rulers, from terror into trade. Yet the fire that drove them, the desire to test every horizon, still burned. Beyond the islands and the rivers they had conquered lay other waters, other worlds. The next generation would follow the same wind, but toward a different destiny. The sea waited, endless and patient, and when they launched their ships once more, it was not as thieves in the night, but as kings in all but name. The winter of 865 fell hard on the English plains. Frost clung to the reeds along the rivers, and the fields lay silent beneath a sky the colour of lead. From the north came the sound of horns, low, drawn-out notes that seemed to carry not through air, but through the bones of the earth. Villagers in Northumbria looked up from their hearths and saw smoke rising in the distance, too thick and too dark to be missed. The Northmen had returned, but this time they did not come to raid and flee. They came to stay. Their ships, hundreds of them, filled the Humber estuary like a forest of masts. From their decks poured men hardened by 2 generations of war. Danes, Norwegians, Norse Gaels, bound together under a banner the English would remember in fear. The great heathen army. At its head was Ivar, the Boneless, a strategist whose frail legs belied a will of iron. The skalds said he could not walk without aid, yet he commanded as though the gods themselves had lent him sight. Beside him rode Halfdan and Ubi, brothers in blood and ambition, carrying with them the dream their father, Ragnar, had begun. Northumbria, already torn by civil strife, could not withstand them. The city of York fell within weeks. Its churches were stripped, its towers crowned with ravens. The invaders took what they wanted, but they did not leave. Instead, they fortified the city and made it their seat. From York, they spread south, a tide of iron sweeping through the kingdoms of East Anglia and Mercia. Only Wessex resisted. There, a young king named Alfred held the last Saxon line. He was neither tall nor commanding in voice, yet his resolve was carved from the same stone as his faith. He studied his enemies as carefully as he prayed, learning their tactics, their rhythms, their patience. When others saw only terror in the Northmen's sails, Alfred saw opportunity. They were men, not monsters. They could be beaten. The first battles went against him. Reading fell, then Ashdown flared like a spark in the dark. Each victory and defeat left the land soaked in blood. The Viking shield walls, bristling with spears and howling with chants to Odin, met the Saxon ranks with thunderous impact. The clash of iron echoed through valleys, through generations. But war, to Ivar, was never only about the sword. He understood fear, the currency that had made his people's name a weapon. He spread rumors of his invincibility, of gods walking beside him. When cities surrendered before battle, he accepted their tribute with cold satisfaction. Yet even he could not command eternity. By the decade's end, his body failed him, and the great strategist of the North was gone, his bones unbroken, his legend unending. In his absence, the Norse dominions in England hardened into something new. The Danelaw, a realm of law and language as foreign to the Saxons as their faith had once been to the North. Here, Norse jarls ruled from wooden halls built beside ruined abbeys. They governed through assemblies, the Thing, where free men spoke their minds beneath the open sky. Justice was measured not by divine decree, but by reputation, oath, and vengeance. Yet even within these borders, the world was shifting. The children of settlers spoke both tongues. The sons of Norsemen carried Saxon names. What had begun as conquest was turning into coexistence. A warrior might still raise his hammer to Thor, but he might also mark his child with the sign of the cross, if only to keep the peace. The gods of the North were not dethroned, but they were no longer alone. Across the sea, the same transformation took root in Ireland and Scotland. Norse Gael kingdoms flourished, strange hybrids of Nordic strength and Celtic cunning. Their rulers bore names that mingled both worlds, their ships flying banners that blended serpent and cross. They traded more than they fought, building towns where bards and skalds shared the same fires, each singing their people's past in a language the other could half understand. Meanwhile, in the cold Atlantic, rumors spread of new lands. The sea, once an edge, had become a map of possibilities. Explorers sailed beyond the Shetlands and the Orkneys, finding lonely islands where sheep outnumbered men. These voyages carried no armies, only families and flocks, a quieter form of conquest, though no less enduring. One such voyage, led by a chieftain named Ingolfur Arnason, pushed further west than any before. Driven by exile and pride, he followed the flight of ravens into the fog and found a shore where hot springs steamed through the frost. There he built his hall and named the place Reykjavik, the Bay of Smoke. Around it, other settlers gathered, bringing their customs, their sagas, their laws. In that frozen outpost, a new society took shape, bound not by kings, but by consensus. They called their assembly the Althing, the All-Thing, where every free man could speak. In the centuries to come, it would outlive the very kingdoms that had birthed it. Yet even as some sought peace across the sea, others sought power at home. The Danelaw's jarls grew wealthy and ambitious, ruling their English lands as miniature kings. Alfred watched them carefully, striking when their alliances frayed. At Edington in 878, he gathered what remained of his army and met the Viking host in battle. Rain turned the field to mud, shields locked, swords broke, and men fought knee-deep in blood. When the sun finally burned through the mist, the Norse lines broke, and their leader, Guthrum, fled. Alfred did not kill him. Instead, he offered peace on one condition: baptism. Guthrum accepted. The rivers that had carried fire and death now bore witness to conversion. It was not the end of the Viking world, but it was the beginning of its transformation. In the years that followed, Alfred rebuilt his kingdom with the patience of a craftsman. He raised fortresses along the rivers, trained militias, and filled monasteries with scholars. He understood what few kings of his age could. To defeat the Vikings, one had to outlast them. When he died, the balance between north and south hung in fragile harmony. For the Northmen, defeat did not mean disappearance. It meant adaptation. They learned the ways of rule from the people they had conquered, and in time became indistinguishable from them. In their halls, Norse warriors debated law in English, prayed to Christ in Latin, and told sagas in the tongue of their ancestors. Their ships still lined the coasts, but their hearts had begun to look inland. The age of endless raiding was giving way to something older, perhaps nobler, the age of kings and sea kings. The Vikings, who had once sworn only to the gods of war, now dreamed of dynasties. Their children would not remember the world before Lindisfarne, but they would inherit its fire. Somewhere in the North Atlantic, a trader's ship caught the evening wind. The oars rested, the sails billowed, and the horizon stretched wide and silent. Behind him lay the lands of his fathers, half Christian, half pagan, all restless. Ahead lay only sea and promise. For the Northmen, that was enough. When the smoke of battle lifted from England, the Northmen found themselves changed. What had begun as fire and fury had settled into the slower burn of rule. Across the Danelaw, Norse law mixed with Saxon custom, creating a patchwork of languages and loyalties. Towns that had once trembled now hummed with trade. The same rivers that had carried fleets of warships now bore cargoes of wool, iron, and wine. In York, the jewel of the north, the longhouses stood beside stone churches. Norse runes were carved beside Latin letters. Sagas and psalms echoed from neighbouring halls. Markets stretched from the riverbanks to the gates, filled with the smell of smoked fish and wet iron. Coins bearing Norse names, Halfdan, Guthrum, and others, circulated in the hands of both conqueror and conquered. The Northmen had come as plunderers, but stayed as rulers, and in that transformation, they discovered something their forefathers had never imagined: the art of permanence. Yet the same restlessness that had driven them to sea would not sleep. Beyond the Danelaw's borders, the Isles of the West called to them. Scotland's rugged coast became a chessboard of ambition, where Norse jarls built fortresses atop cliffs and married into Pictish and Gaelic families. From these unions rose new lords, half Norse, half native, whose loyalties were bound to sea and land alike. The Orkneys and Shetlands became waypoints of power, their harbours filled with ships flying serpent banners beside Celtic crosses. Further south, the Irish Sea glittered with sails. Norse gale fleets linked Dublin to the Hebrides, to York, and even to Brittany. Across these waters flowed a culture that belonged to no single land. Their poets mixed Irish rhythm with Norse imagery. Their warriors swore oaths on both cross and hammer. They were traders and mercenaries, kings and pirates, citizens of the tide. Still, the heart of the Viking world remained in the north. In Norway, small kingdoms clashed endlessly, their fjords echoing with the sound of oars and battle horns. No single ruler could yet claim the whole land, but ambition ran deep. Jarls fought for dominance, not just with the sword, but with the gift, the economy of generosity that held their followers' loyalty. Power was a balance of courage and coin, of glory and restraint. One such ruler, Harold of Vestfold, watched the chaos and saw opportunity. He was young, proud, and possessed of a vision rare among men of his age. A united Norway ruled under one crown. He swore an oath that he would not cut his hair until all the petty kings had bowed before him. For years, he fought battle after battle, pushing north and west, forging alliances through marriage and war. When at last his enemies yielded, he washed his hair in the sea and was called Harald Fairhair, the first to dream of a single northern throne. His triumph, however, came at a cost. Many of the jarls who refused his rule fled, taking their ships and their followers across the ocean. Some found refuge in the Scottish Isles. Others sought a new world altogether. Among them were those who had already heard tales of the land Ingolfur Arnason had claimed beyond the Western Sea, a cold, untouched country where steam rose from the earth and rivers ran clear through lava fields. They called it Iceland. The voyage was perilous. Ships left the fjords in summer, following the flight of birds or the drift of whales. Fog hid the sun for days. Storms scattered fleets and swallowed whole families. Yet those who reached land found a world both harsh and free. There were no kings to obey, no taxes to pay, only the raw elements and the strength of their own hands. They built turf halls against the wind and set their livestock grazing on the sparse grass. They divided land by oath and fairness, recorded in memory rather than parchment. In time, their society took form, not through royal decree, but through common will. Each district chose its chieftain, not as ruler, but as representative. Disputes were settled by gathering beneath the open sky at the Althing, where all free men could speak and vote. It was a republic in all but name, bound not by crowns, but by consensus. Here, the spirit of the North, its independence, its stubborn pride, found its purest expression. The skalds who sailed to Iceland brought with them not treasure, but memory. They carried the sagas in their heads, the long lines of verse that preserved the deeds of gods and heroes. Around the fire, they recited the old stories, the forging of the world from Ymir's bones, the wanderings of Odin, the doom awaiting at Ragnarok. In the stillness of that stark land, these tales became scripture. While Europe's monks wrote their histories on parchment, the Icelanders wove theirs into the living fabric of speech. Meanwhile, in the broader north, power was shifting. The great raids that had once shaken empires were fewer now. The wealth of Europe had been harvested. Its armies had learned vigilance. The Norse turned their ambition inward, fortifying their towns, minting their coins, and codifying their laws. Across Denmark, Harald Fairhair's example stirred new aspirations. The age of scattered chieftains was ending. The age of kings was beginning. But even kings could not tame the sea. The same waves that had carried the first raiders now carried traders, missionaries, and exiles. The North was becoming connected not only by conquest, but by exchange. In the ports of Hedeby and Birka, merchants haggled over silks from Byzantium and silver from the east. Runes carved on whalebone recorded debts and promises. The Northmen had entered history's bloodstream, and the world could no longer ignore their pulse. In a longhouse overlooking the icy fjord, an old sailor told a tale to his grandchildren. He spoke of the time when he was young, when ships had burned monasteries and kings had paid ransom in silver. His voice cracked with smoke and age, yet in his eyes the sea still glimmered. "We thought the world ended at the horizon," he said. "We were wrong. It begins there." The children listened, wide-eyed, imagining sails like wings and storms that sang the names of gods. For them, the age of raiding was a story, not a memory. They would inherit a different world, one of trade, law, and faith. But the hunger that had once driven their ancestors still whispered in their blood. By the close of the 9th century, the North stood at a crossroads. The Viking had become the settler, the raider, the ruler. Across the seas they had conquered, a new identity was forming, not of place, but of people. They were the sons and daughters of the storm, bound to the sea, yet learning the weight of soil. The gods of Asgard still watched from the cold heavens, but their dominion was fading. Below, men were learning to shape their own fate. The sagas would remember both, the fury and the wisdom, the sword and the plough. The world the Vikings had torn open was mending into something greater. And in its quiet heart, the North waited, ready for the next tide. Mist hung low over the river, thick enough to hide the banks. The water moved sluggishly beneath the longship's hull, brown and cold, carrying the smell of pine and silt. A man stood at the prow, his beard rimed with frost, his hand tight on the steering oar. Around him, his crew rowed in silence, their breath rising in clouds. The oars dipped and lifted with the rhythm of habit, the only sound in a land that seemed to sleep. Somewhere ahead, a bell rang from the trees. It was not a church bell, but iron struck against wood, the call of another trading post. They had been rowing for weeks, following the rivers that cut through the heart of the eastern forests. Never, Volkov, Lovat, each name new to their tongues. Their ship, built for the sea, now glided through inland water, like a predator in a flooded forest. On both sides stretched endless trees, heavy with snow and silence. The men called themselves Rus, a word born from rodsmen, the rowers, and though they came from the fjords of Sweden, they were no longer bound to any single coast. They were traders, warriors, explorers, Varangians, servants of the oar and the axe. At last, the river widened into a lake, and on its shore rose a cluster of huts and palisades. This was Novgorod, a place not yet a city, but already a promise. Smoke drifted from the hearths. Dogs barked. A handful of local tribesmen came forward with furs slung across their shoulders. The Varangians exchanged them for glass beads, bronze tools, and fragments of silver. Every trade was an alliance, sealed not by parchment, but by gift and blood. From these rough beginnings, something larger was stirring. Along the river routes, the Northmen built fortified settlements, Holmgard, Ladoga, Smolensk, each a link in a chain stretching toward the south. Beyond lay the Dnieper, a serpent of water winding toward the Black Sea, and beyond that, the riches of Byzantium. To reach it meant dragging ships across portages, fighting rapids, and paying tribute to tribes that guarded the banks. But those who survived returned with stories of cities whose walls shone like gold, where emperors ruled over markets that never slept. The Norse had always been traders, but the East demanded a different kind of courage. Here, wealth was not taken by fire, but earned by endurance. The most prized treasure was not gold, but silver, dirhams from the Caliphate, stamped with Arabic script none of them could read, but all understood as power. These coins flowed north in thousands, carried in belts and buried in hoards across Sweden. They became the currency of the Viking world, proof that the edge of the north now touched the heart of the east. In time, one Varangian leader rose above the rest. His name was Rurik. Some said he was invited by the local tribes to bring order to their quarrels. Others claimed he took it by force. Whatever the truth, by 862, he ruled from Novgorod, commanding both Slavs and Norsemen. His followers spread south, founding new towns along the river routes. Among them were his kinsmen Oleg and Igor, who would push the frontier as far as Kiev. a city set high on the Dnieper's cliffs. From there, they looked not north, but south, to Constantinople, the greatest city on earth. The Greeks called these northern traders varangoi, the axe-bearing men of Rus. Their arrival at the gates of Constantinople was both threat and marvel. They came not as beggars, but as merchants and mercenaries, offering furs, wax, and slaves in exchange for silk, wine, and coin. Sometimes they traded peacefully. Other times they stormed the walls with fire and fury. Yet even when they failed, they left an impression. The emperors of Byzantium, pragmatic as always, learned that it was better to hire wolves than to fight them. So the Varangians entered the empire's service. Tall, fair-haired, and bound by oaths of loyalty, they became the Varangian Guard, elite soldiers sworn to the Byzantine throne. In the marble corridors of Constantinople, their axes gleamed under candlelight, and their foreign tongues echoed among the mosaics. They guarded emperors, fought in distant wars, and carried the songs of the north into the heart of civilization. Back in the northern forests, the Rus built their own kind of empire. They adopted Slavic speech, Christian customs, and Byzantine luxury, but their spirit remained Norse. They ruled by charisma and iron, collecting tribute from tribes and controlling trade with an efficiency born of the sea. The rivers were their roads, their ships their crowns. Meanwhile, farther west, other winds were stirring. Across the Atlantic, Norway's exiles followed routes that would carry them beyond the edge of any map. But for now, their stories belong to rumor, the whisper of a horizon still hidden by mist. The east was the present, the west a dream waiting to take shape. In the shipyards of Birka, craftsmen hammered nails into hulls meant for both. The market there had become a crossroads of worlds. Traders from Rus arrived with silver coins bearing Arabic script. Danes from Hedeby brought glassware from Francia. Norwegians sold walrus ivory from the north. Languages mixed like metals in a forge. The Norse had once been defined by isolation, by fjords, forests, and ice. But now their world was wider than ever before. And yet, even in this age of commerce, their hearts remained bound to the old gods. In the marshes outside, Birka stood a great temple at Uppsala, where sacrifices were still offered to Odin, Thor, and Freya. Travelers from the south, horrified and fascinated, wrote of it as a hall of blood and gold. Inside, the idols gleamed in the torchlight, and the air smelled of pine and iron. For the men who sailed the rivers of Rus or the seas of the west, such worship was not superstition, it was covenant. The gods who had carried their ancestors through storm and war were now asked to guard them in trade and empire. One evening, on the river near Novgorod, a Varangian crew made camp beneath a grove of birch. They lit their fires and set their silver scales aside. A skald sang of home, of fjords glowing under the midnight sun, of mothers waiting beside the hearth, of comrades buried in frozen ground. His voice mingled with the rush of the river and the crackle of flame. Around him, men listened, their eyes reflecting the firelight and the stars. They were far from the lands of their birth, yet something in that song bridged the distance. For the first time, the North had found its reflection in another world. From the Black Sea to the Baltic, from the steppes to the stormy coasts of Norway, the Norse spirit had learned to navigate not only waves, but civilizations. They were no longer wanderers in search of silver. They were architects of connection, shaping a world linked by river and sea. And still, beyond the sunset, the western wind waited. The sea beyond Iceland was not made for men. Its waves were mountains, its fogs endless, its silence so deep that even gulls seemed afraid to cry. Yet into that silence sailed those who had already tamed half the known world. Their ships were small compared to the vastness they faced, planks of pine and oak stitched together with iron and faith. They trusted not in maps, which did not yet exist, but in the flight of birds, the colour of the water, the taste of wind. The Norse had always believed that beyond every horizon lay another. Now, they meant to prove it. Among the voyagers was a man called Eric the Red. His name came not from his hair, but from his temper, which had driven him from Norway and later from Iceland. Exile was a common inheritance in the north. When blood was spilled, the guilty did not die. They sailed. Eric took his family, his followers, and a stubborn hope, steering west into the grey unknown. For weeks, they drifted through fog, guided by ravens loosed into the sky. When one bird did not return, he followed its path and found land. Mountains of ice gave way to green valleys and fjords deep as Norway's own. He called it Greenland, a name chosen to deceive, for even then the earth was more white than green. Eric returned to Iceland with tales of a vast island ready for settlers. Hopeful or desperate, hundreds followed him. They built farms along the western fjords, sowed barley in the thin soil, and raised halls where no human song had ever been heard. Against the cold, they clung to memory of Norway's forests, of Iceland's sagas, of the gods who had carried them so far. In that stark silence, they built not empire, but endurance. Among Eric's sons was Leif, who had inherited his father's hunger, but not his fury. He grew up listening to sailors' stories, of strange birds that flew from the west, of driftwood unlike any found in the north, of land glimpsed through fog, where grapes grew wild. When he came of age, he gathered a crew and sailed beyond his father's farthest reach. What they found would live only in legend, a coast of forests and beaches, where rivers ran sweet and the air smelled of earth instead of salt. They called it Vinland. Some said it lay beyond Greenland. Some said it was only dream. But in either case, it proved that even the end of the world was not enough for the Northmen. While these voyages stretched the Norse imagination, the heart of Scandinavia was beginning to change. The endless rivalries among chieftains were giving way to something more enduring: kingdoms. In Denmark, Gorm the Old consolidated his rule, building the foundations of a dynasty that would outlast the Viking Age itself. His court at Jelling became the center of a new order: law, coinage, and stone carved with runes that declared the king's name and his gods. His son, Harald Bluetooth, inherited more than a throne. He inherited a choice. The age of Odin and Thor was fading, not from defeat, but from exhaustion. The old gods had demanded courage and sacrifice. The new faith promised unity and peace. Christian missionaries had long wandered the coasts, preaching in words the Vikings did not trust but could not ignore. Harald, ever the pragmatist, saw what war had not achieved. A single faith might achieve through persuasion. To unite the Danes, he embraced Christianity. The Jelling stones he raised stand as witnesses to that transformation. On one side, the runes proclaim him the king who made the Danes Christian. On the other, the carved serpent of his ancestors winds defiantly around the cross. It was not conversion through surrender, but through synthesis. The Norse spirit bent without breaking. Norway followed its own path. Kings rose and fell with the tide, their authority challenged by jarls and farmers alike. Yet even there, the winds of change were felt. The cross appeared beside the hammer on banners. Priests shared space with skalds in the longhouse. Faith, like empire, was becoming a negotiation. In Sweden, the old gods held longest. The temple at Uppsala still gleamed with offerings. Sacrifices still hung from the sacred trees. The Swedes had little reason to abandon their gods. Trade with the East made them wealthy, and their Varangian kinsmen ruled distant cities. Yet even here, whispers of baptism began to circulate, carried by merchants returning from Rus and the empire of the Greeks. The North was being drawn into the wider current of Christendom, willingly or not. Trade shaped faith as much as faith shaped trade. Along the river markets of Rus, Byzantine icons hung beside Norse amulets. In the ports of Denmark, silver coins bore crosses instead of hammers. Conversion was as practical as it was spiritual. To do business with the South meant speaking the language of its god. The Northmen did not abandon their beliefs overnight. They added to them. They prayed to Christ for calm seas and to Thor for fair wind, hedging their bets with eternity. At home, the signs of wealth grew unmistakable. The runestones of Sweden and Denmark told not only of battles won, but of bridges built, of lands measured, of families remembering their dead in stone. The world of the raider had given way to the world of the ruler. Power was measured not in plunder, but in permanence. And yet, even in their new prosperity, the Vikings could not escape the call of the sea. Trade routes crisscrossed the north like veins of silver. From Birka and Hedeby to Kiev and Byzantium, from Dublin to Greenland, the Norse wove the first true network of the northern world. They carried not just goods, but ideas, law, art, faith, language. The carved beasts on their ships evolved into patterns of interlaced crosses and serpents, symbols of a people balancing two worlds. Their poetry softened, turning from boasts of slaughter to reflections on fate. The same hands that once raised axes now carved runes of remembrance. In one Danish hall, a skald recited before King Harold. His voice rose like surf, singing of a time when men had crossed oceans and faced gods in the storm. "We have seen the ends of the world," he said, "and still the sea is not finished with us." The king smiled, but did not answer. He knew that the sea never finished with anyone. By the middle of the 10th century, Scandinavia stood poised between ages. Behind them lay centuries of conquest and discovery. Before them, the slow dawn of kingdoms and churches. The longships still dotted the harbours, but their sails no longer promised terror. They promised trade. The Viking Age had reached its peak, its edges touching every corner of the known world. Yet the same restlessness that had built that world would soon begin to unmake it. The rise of kings would bring unity, but also obedience. The free jarls and wandering crews who had carried the fury of the north would find themselves servants to crowns and crosses. The gods who once demanded blood would fade into memory, their names kept alive only in poetry. Still, for a time, the north stood unchallenged, a civilization of sailors and poets, warriors and builders, bound by the wind. The sagas would remember this as their golden age, when the world seemed infinite and the Northmen its measure. Far beyond the horizon, in a land called Vinland, the footprints of their ships would fade under snow, waiting for another age to find them again. The bells of Jelling rang not for prayer, but for power. Their bronze voices carried across the Danish plain, echoing over the new wooden church that rose beside the old pagan mound. On its slope stood two great stones, one carved with runes and dragons, the other with a cross and the name of a king. Between them, King Harold Bluetooth watched the workers haul timber into place, their breath misting in the morning chill. The church was small compared to the temples of the south, but its meaning was vast. For the first time, Denmark bowed to a single faith, and a single ruler. Harold had inherited a kingdom bound by trade and blood, but divided by belief. His father, Gorm the Old, had ruled in the name of Odin. Harold ruled in the name of himself. He was a man of vision and calculation, who understood that the world was changing faster than the oar could row. The Franks and Germans to the south were no longer raiders' prey, but empires armed with priests. To survive among them, the North would have to speak their language, wear their symbols, and master their politics. Christianity was not submission, it was strategy. Still, the conversion of a people who had sung to Thor for centuries could not be decreed by rune or sword alone. Across Denmark, farmers still hung hammers on their doors. Warriors still called on Odin before battle. The priests who came from Saxony found themselves preaching to men who nodded politely, then poured libations to Freyr at sunset. Harold knew better than to force them. Instead, he built bridges, literal and spiritual. Churches rose beside old sacred groves. Baptismal fonts were carved from stone once used for sacrifices. When questioned by his jarls, Harold simply said, "The gods have not abandoned us. They have changed their names." Under his rule, Denmark became more than a collection of rival jarldoms. Roads linked towns that had once stood alone. Coins bearing his cross and name replaced the barter of old. Fortresses called Trelleborgs ringed the kingdom, perfect circles of earth and timber, each designed to hold warriors and stores for 100 days' siege. They were not mere defenses, but declarations. The age of chieftains was over. To the west, Norway still resisted. The land of deep fjords and scattered clans had never known a single crown. Its people valued independence as fiercely as life itself. Among them rose Olaf Tryggvason, a man of noble birth and restless ambition. Born in exile, baptized by monks in the Baltic, he returned to Norway, not as a supplicant, but as a conqueror. With fleets at his back and the cross on his sail, he began the work Harold had only started, to bind a land through faith and fire. Olaf's conversion was sincere, but his methods were iron. He offered baptism to his enemies. Those who refused met the axe. Pagan temples burned, idols sank into rivers, and the name of Christ spread with the smoke. Yet even as the people bent their knees, many whispered their old prayers under breath. The new faith ruled their tongues, not their hearts. Farther east, Sweden stood apart. Its kings, still half myth, ruled from Uppsala, where the great temple gleamed with gold. There, sacrifices were offered to Odin, Thor, and Freyr as they had been for generations. Missionaries came and vanished, their words swallowed by the roar of the crowd. The Swedes had no need for foreign gods. The old ones had served them well. Their ships still brought silver from Rus and furs from the far north. Their jarls grew rich on trade, not faith. But faith has a way of following silver. In the markets of Birka, traders from Saxony and the Empire brought crosses as easily as coins. The young listened, curious, while their elders scoffed. The priests spoke of a god who forgave rather than avenged, a strange thought in a land built on oath and blood. Yet even the most skeptical found comfort in the promise of eternal life. Valhalla was glory, but brief. Heaven, they were told, was peace everlasting. For a people weary of war, that promise had weight. Back in Denmark, Harald Bluetooth faced challenges from within. His son, Sweyn, young and ambitious, gathered warriors who longed for the old ways. To them, their father's Christianity was weakness, his diplomacy betrayal. The North, they said, was not meant to bow. The feud between father and son grew until steel decided what faith could not. Harold fell in battle. his new kingdom torn between old gods and new loyalties. Yet his work would endure. The church he built, the coins he minted, the walls he raised, all would outlast him. As kings rose and fell, a quieter revolution took root across the sea. In Iceland, where no monarch ruled, the Althing continued to meet beneath the open sky. The settlers there, descended from exiles and explorers, had built a society without kingship, only law. Each summer, they gathered at Thingvellir, the valley of the assembly, where lava cliffs echoed with debate. Chieftains argued cases, poets recited sagas, traders exchanged goods. Justice was not decreed from above, but agreed upon among equals. It was a fragile order, but one born of freedom, not fear. Still, even Iceland could not escape the tide of belief sweeping the north. Missionaries arrived from Norway, preaching that the gods of old were fading and that salvation waited under a different name. The island's people were divided. Some saw the new faith as foreign intrusion, others as inevitable progress. For a decade, the arguments raged, until, as the story goes, a single man ended them. At the Althing, around the year 1000, a respected lawgiver named Thorgir was chosen to decide. He withdrew into silence, laying a cloak over his head for a day and a night. When he emerged, he declared that Iceland would accept Christianity, but those who wished might still honor the old gods in secret. It was a compromise so uniquely Icelandic that even the priests accepted it. The people cheered, sacrifices ceased. The North's last pagan stronghold had chosen peace over pride. By then, the year itself had gained symbolic weight. To the chroniclers of the South, 1000 AD marked the dawn of a new millennium, a world reborn under the cross. For the North, it marked something different, the end of an age that had lasted 3 centuries, defined by sail and sword, fire and faith. The longships still rested in their harbours, their planks tarred, their dragon heads covered in cloth. But the men who had once filled them now bent to ploughs, minted coins, built churches. The sound of oars was replaced by bells, the howl of the storm by the murmur of prayer. The gods of Asgard had not been slain, they had been remembered into myth. Beneath the hymns and Latin prayers, the old rhythm endured, in the way men spoke of honor, in the way women traced runes on wood, in the way every doorframe still bore a charm against ill fortune. The North remembered itself. The world had changed, but the sea still whispered the same stories. The year 1000 passed like a breath over the North, barely noticed, yet forever remembered. The old gods had not vanished in a single storm, nor had the new faith conquered by peace alone. It was a slow eclipse, one light fading as another rose, the two overlapping for generations. Across the fjords and plains, one could see the balance everywhere. A church bell hung where once a hammer had been carved, a rune stone bearing a cross beside the names of men who still swore by Odin. In Denmark, Sweyn Forkbeard ruled in the shadow of both his father and his gods. He had driven Harald Bluetooth into exile and taken the throne by force. Yet he ruled not as a destroyer, but as a consolidator. The kingdom his father had shaped through strategy, he hardened through strength. Under Sweyn, Denmark became a kingdom of harbours and armies, of bishops and warlords, an uneasy truce between Christ and the old faith. His fleets patrolled the Baltic, his traders reached east to Rus and west to England. The line between commerce and conquest blurred, until even kings could not tell the difference. In Norway, Olaf Tryggvason's star burned bright and brief. His zeal for conversion turned to tyranny, his mercy to obsession. Temples were torn down, sacred groves cut, and those who resisted baptism met the sword. He built churches faster than the land could fill them, yet for all his fervour, his reign was as fleeting as summer light. In 1000, the same year Iceland accepted Christianity by law, Olaf fell at the Battle of Svolder, betrayed by allies and engulfed by the sea he had once commanded. The poet said he rose from the waves in a blaze of light, carried to heaven by the faith he had forced upon others. His enemies said the sea took him as it takes all men who think themselves gods. After his death, Norway fractured again. Jarls and petty kings divided the realm, each claiming the mantle of unity. Yet even amid chaos, the seeds Olaf had sown took root. The priests stayed, the crosses remained, and the language of faith found its way into law and song. The next kings would inherit both the sword and the psalter. Sweden stood between two worlds. Its forests still echoed with the chants of Uppsala. Its ports rang with the clatter of silver coins stamped with crosses. The kings of the Mälaren Valley looked both east and west. Their power balanced between pagan loyalty and Christian diplomacy. Olof Skjutkonung, the first Swedish king to be baptized, ruled with calculated moderation. He minted coins bearing the cross of Christ, yet allowed the old temple to stand. To foreign envoys, he was a Christian ruler. To his people, a cautious mediator between gods. The North had learned the art of coexistence. Everywhere, kingship replaced chieftainship. The thing still met, but its power waned. Law now flowed from the throne downward rather than from the people upward. Standing armies, once a foreign idea, became instruments of royal will. Roads and fortresses spread across lands that had once known only forest and sea. The scattered realms of the north were learning the grammar of governance, but the heart of that governance was faith. Christianity offered a unity that raiding never could. It linked the north to the rest of Europe, giving its rulers legitimacy in the eyes of emperors and popes. The church became both ally and rival, a partner in civilization, a check on ambition. Bishops advised kings, yet their wealth and words sometimes carried more power than the sword. In the long halls where skalds had once sung of Thor's hammer, monks now read aloud from Latin manuscripts. Still, beneath the incense and prayer, the old rhythm endured. The Northmen might bow in churches, but their hearts still turned toward the sea. Their faith had changed, but not their fate. They still built ships with the same curves, carved beasts upon their prows, and named them after gods they no longer worshipped. When storms struck, even Christian sailors sometimes muttered a prayer to Njord, god of the waves, just in case the new one was listening elsewhere. Trade grew richer than war. The markets of Hedeby, Birka, and Ribe bustled with goods from every horizon. Spices from the east, silk from Byzantium, and amber from the Baltic. The longships that once carried warriors now bore merchants and pilgrims. Their oars no longer beat to the rhythm of war chants, but to the creak of commerce. The Norse had not lost their hunger. They had merely changed its object. Yet peace brought its own dangers. The warrior spirit that had once forged their identity had no clear purpose. Sons of Jarls found themselves governing farms instead of commanding fleets. Some turned to the church, trading sword for staff. Others left altogether, sailing south to serve as mercenaries in foreign wars. In Byzantium, the Varangian Guard swelled with northern recruits, men who sought not plunder but pay, and found in the empire's gold a familiar kind of glory. In Iceland, the sagas began to take shape, the oral tales of heroes and gods, of voyages and vengeance. were now written on vellum by Christian hands. What had once been living memory became literature, preserved for a world that would one day forget. The scribes wrote not in Latin, but in their own tongue, as if to remind the new age that the North had a voice of its own. In those lines, Odin still wandered, Thor still thundered, and the old world lived again, tamed, perhaps, but not silenced. Across Scandinavia, churches rose where temples once stood, but many of them were built of the same timber, using the same joinery as the old halls. The shape of the roof, the curve of the beams, the carvings of serpents along the eaves, all whispered of continuity. Even in conversion, the Norse refused to forget themselves. Their god might now hang on a cross, but the wood that bore him came from their own forests. By the end of the century, the North stood transformed. Kings ruled from stone halls, priests copied scripture in candlelight, markets rang with the sounds of a continent newly connected. The word Viking had begun to lose its meaning. To go a Viking no longer meant survival. It meant nostalgia, a memory of a wilder past. Yet that past still glimmered in the blood. When storms rolled over the sea and thunder split the sky, even the most devout might pause, listening for the echo of a hammer. The world of the North had entered history proper, leaving behind the legend of its birth. The children of Odin had become kings of Christ, and the line between faith and fate blurred into a single story. The sagas would call this the twilight of the old gods. But twilight is not darkness. It is transformation. The same light that faded from Asgard now shone from the steeples of new cathedrals. A sea that had once carried raiders now mirrored those steeples in its calm. The North had not surrendered. It had evolved. And in that evolution lay the seed of another kind of conquest. One fought not with swords, but with crowns. Tides were out along the Thames, and the riverbank stank of mud and smoke. From the east came the sound of horns, long and low, rolling over the grey water. English sentries on London's half-rebuilt walls peered through the mist and saw sails, not a few, but a forest of them. Their curved prows gleamed with wet iron, their dragon heads cut the fog. The invaders had come before, but never like this. It was not a raid, it was a reckoning. At their head stood Svein Forkbeard, King of Denmark, son of Harold Bluetooth and heir to 2 legacies, the axe and the cross. His father had baptized Denmark in diplomacy. His son would baptize England in fire. Behind him came jarls and warriors from every coast of the north, their shields painted with symbols that once called on gods, now serving kings. Some fought for silver, others for vengeance, others simply because the sea had taught them no other life. The English called them Danes, but they were more than that. They were the last generation to remember the old world, men who had raided as their fathers had done, yet lived in a new one, ruled by crowns and priests. Their oaths were sworn not in mead halls, but before altars. Their banners carried crosses, but their hearts still burned with the hunger that had carried their ancestors across the oceans. England, fractured by weak kings and feuding nobles, could not hold. The longships filled the rivers, their crews moving with the precision of habit. Towns that resisted were burned. Those that yielded paid tribute. The Danegeld that once bought peace now bought submission. In 1013, London itself opened its gates. The king, Ethelred, fled to Normandy. Svein Forkbeard was crowned on English soil, the first foreign ruler to unite the North Sea beneath a single will. He did not rule long. Within a year, he was dead, struck down, some said, by illness, others by the hand of God. His death was sudden, but his vision endured. His son, Canute, barely 20, inherited both his crown and his challenge. England rose against him, and for a time it seemed the old pattern would repeat: invasions, battles, endless cycles of revenge. But Canute was not his father. He was patient, shrewd, and born to rule rather than raid. In 1016, he met the English army at Asanden and crushed it utterly. Blood turned the fields to mud, and the Saxons' defiance bled away with the tide. When the fighting ended, Nut offered peace, not as conqueror to conquered, but as king to subjects. He married Emma of Normandy, widow of the fallen Ethelred, and through her claimed both legitimacy and alliance. What his father had taken by force, he secured by law. Thus began the North Sea Empire, a realm that stretched from the chalk cliffs of England to the icy coasts of Norway. It was not bound by land, but by water, its highways the same seas that had once carried raiders. Merchants, envoys, and soldiers crossed it as easily as birds cross sky. The same coins circulated in York and Roskilde. The same prayers were sung in Winchester and Ribe. For a brief generation, the North ruled itself and half the world beyond. Nut ruled not as a barbarian, but as a monarch in the European style. He strengthened the church, founded monasteries, and corresponded with the Pope. His court was fluent in Latin as well as Old Norse. His scribes kept law codes in both tongues. Yet his power rested on the same foundations his ancestors had built: loyalty, fear, and the sea. He rewarded his warriors with land, ensuring their swords stayed sheathed in his service. He divided the kingdom into earldoms, governed by men he trusted, many of them Norse by birth, but English by oath. To the English, Inut was both foreign and familiar. He taxed them, but he also protected them. The Viking raids that had terrorized their shores for 2 centuries ceased under his rule, not because the Vikings had vanished, but because they now wore his badge. The terror of the North had become its peacekeeper. Across the sea, Denmark flourished as the empire's heart. Roskilde's harbours filled with ships from every horizon, traders from Flanders, envoys from Normandy, pilgrims bound for Rome. The wealth of 2 kingdoms flowed through its markets. Churches rose beside shipyards, and priests blessed the same men who still drank to Odin in private. The contradictions of the North were no longer hidden. They were its strength. Norway, however, was slower to bow. Its rugged clans remembered too well the days of independence. Even under Knut's governors, rebellion simmered in the fjords. Among those who would one day challenge the empire was a young exile named Harald Sigurdsson, later known as Harald Hardrada. As a boy, he had fled Norway after his brother's defeat. As a man, he would serve in the Varangian Guard of Byzantium, returning with the wealth and wisdom of the East. But that was still to come. For now, he was one of countless Norsemen whose ambition outgrew their homeland. Nut, for all his power, understood impermanence. He had seen kingdoms rise and vanish with the turn of the tide. To preserve his legacy, he sought to bind his empire not just by force, but by faith. He built churches, patronized monasteries, and sent gifts to Rome. Chroniclers recorded that he walked barefoot in penance to St. Cuthbert's shrine, a gesture that astonished both Saxon monks and Norse jarls. The Sea King had become a pilgrim. Yet power breeds shadows. The empire's unity depended on his presence, and even kings cannot command time. Nut's sons, Harold and Harthacnut, inherited his realm divided, one ruling England, the other Denmark. Rivalry followed, and with it, decay. The North Sea, which had once united, began to separate once more. Still, for a moment, Nut's empire had been real, a northern Rome built not on marble but on oak and will. Its memory would linger long after its fall, a reminder that the North had not merely raided the world, but ruled it. In the twilight of his reign, Nut returned to the shore where his father had first landed in England. There, legend says, his courtiers flattered him, claiming even the sea would obey his word. Nut ordered his throne carried to the water's edge and commanded the tide to halt. When it did not, he smiled and said, "Let all men know that the power of kings is nothing before the power of God." The sea rose around his feet, indifferent and eternal. The empire he had built would not outlive him, but the lesson would. The empire Canute had forged out of wind and water did not crumble overnight. For a few fleeting years after his death, the seas still carried his peace. The fleets that had once plundered now patrolled. The taxes that had once bought safety now paid for order. But empires of the sea are like tides. They can only hold as long as the moon that commands them. When Nut's sons rose against each other, the water began to draw back. Harold Harefoot ruled England. Harthacnut held Denmark. Neither possessed their father's reach. Their quarrel divided the north, setting Dane against Saxon, Saxon against Dane. When both died childless, the crown passed to Edward the Confessor, a king of Norman blood and English birth. The foreign tide had turned. The age when men from the fjords ruled from Winchester was ending. In Denmark, new kings rose from the same bloodlines that had once sworn to Canute. They still called themselves sea kings, but their horizons had shrunk. Trade filled the harbours. War filled their memories. The longships remained, but the hands that built them now built churches instead. To younger generations, the word Viking belonged to songs, not to life. And yet, the fire was not out. Across the north, in Norway, a man was waiting for his time to burn. Harald Sigurdsson, called Hardrida, Hard Ruler, had been 16 when his brother Olaf the Saint fell at Stiklestad. The battle had scattered his kin and broken Norway's brief unity. Harald fled east with a handful of followers, wandering through the forests and rivers until he reached the realm of the Rus. There, his sword earned him passage to a city unlike any he had imagined, Constantinople, the queen of cities. In Byzantium, the world's wealth and wisdom dazzled the northern exile. He joined the Varangian Guard, the emperor's bodyguard of foreign warriors. In the marble halls of the palace, he walked where his ancestors' gods had never dreamed to tread. He fought in Sicily, in the Holy Land, in the palaces of rebellion and splendor. He became rich beyond measure and proud beyond restraint. The Greeks called him Araltes, the Tall One, and whispered of his temper, his cunning, and his refusal to bow. But no gold could silence the sea in his blood. After years of service, he returned north, bringing with him treasure, tales, and the discipline of empire. Norway lay divided under Danish rule, its jarls feuding like wolves over bones. Harold meant to change that. He forged alliances, bribed enemies, and struck when they hesitated. Within a decade, he had done what none since Fairhair had achieved. He ruled a united Norway. His crown, however, sat uneasy. To the east, Sweden eyed his borders. To the south, Denmark mocked his ambition. And beyond them, both lay England, now wealthy and fractured once more. The old dream of the North Sea Empire whispered like a ghost in his ear. Nut's realm could live again, if only one man dared to seize it. In 1066, that man set sail. The wind carried nearly 300 ships down the Norwegian coast, past the Orkneys and Shetlands, across the restless North Sea. Harold's banner, called Landwaster, snapped in the salt wind. a raven on a black field, spreading its wings. He was 60 by then, an age when most men rested, but he had never learned rest. With him sailed his ally Tostig, brother to the English king Harold Godwinson, cast out by his own kin. Together they sought revenge and destiny. They landed at the mouth of the Humber, as Sweyn Forkbeard had done half a century earlier. Towns fell easily, surprised by the sudden storm. At York, the Norse met resistance but triumphed. The city yielded, hostages were exchanged, and Harold believed victory was complete. He had restored the honor of Norway, avenged his brother, and reclaimed the empire of Canute. The sagas say he sat beneath his tent beside the river Derwent, laughing with his men and promising to show them the wealth of the southern shires. Then came news. The English king was marching north. Harold Godwinson had gathered his levies with astonishing speed, forcing his men through forced marches day and night. On September 25th, 1066, they reached the Norse camp at Stamford Bridge. The morning was bright and cold, the kind of day that deceives men into thinking the gods favor them. Harold's army, expecting only the formal exchange of hostages, had left their armor aboard the ships. When the Saxon vanguard crested the hill, the Northmen saw the sunlight flashing on shields and realized too late that fate had come. The battle that followed was chaos turned to legend. Harold rallied his men along the bridge, ordering them into the shield wall that had carried their people through centuries of war. The English struck with fury, but the Norse line held. One axeman, alone on the bridge, is said to have held off dozens, cleaving horse and rider until he was struck from below by a spear through the planks. When the English finally crossed, the field dissolved into slaughter. Harold rode among his men without armor, his blue cloak flying, his voice carrying above the din. An arrow found his throat. He fell without a word, and with him fell the last great sea king. By evening, the river ran red, and the ravens of his banner wheeled above the dead. Of the 300 ships that had brought the army, barely 20 sailed home. Among the survivors was Olaf, Harold's son, who would carry his father's body back to Norway and bury him in Trondheim, beside the kings of old. 3 weeks later, Harold Godwinson himself would die on another field, Hastings, struck down by yet another foreign invader, this one from the south. The Normans, descendants of Viking settlers who had traded raiding for rulership a century earlier, had returned to finish what the North had begun. The circle closed. With Stamford Bridge, the Viking Age ended. Not with conquest, but with exhaustion. The world that had once trembled before the dragon ships now belonged to castles, crusades, and cathedrals. The North still sang of its past, but its future lay in kingdoms, not voyages. Yet the spirit that had driven those voyages never truly died. It lived on in the sagas, sung in Icelandic halls, in the stones carved with dragons and crosses, in the names that dotted the maps of Britain and Normandy. The descendants of Vikings became lords, kings, and storytellers. Their gods faded, but their sense of fate remained. The belief that the world is a sea to be crossed, not a wall to be feared. In the centuries that followed, chroniclers would call Harald Hardrada the last Viking, and perhaps they were right. He had seen Byzantium's gold and England's green fields, fought under every sky between the Black Sea and the North, and died as his ancestors would have wished, on open ground beneath an unbroken sky. His fall marked not just the end of an age, but the beginning of another. Back in Norway, winter came early that year. The fjords froze over, trapping ships in ice. In the silence, old men spoke of the battle as though it had been prophecy. the closing of a saga written before men were born. They said Odin had called his final warrior home, that Valhalla's doors had opened one last time. The priests of Christ shook their heads at such talk, but even they could not deny the poetry of it. The North had entered history as storm and flame. It left as memory and myth. And though its kings would wear crowns instead of helmets, though its people would plough fields instead of seas, they would always look to the horizon with the same quiet defiance. The longships rotted in their boathouses, the runestones weathered under moss, and the world moved on. But in the deep places of the heart, where the sea's rhythm still beats, something of that age endures. The refusal to bow to the limits of the world, the certainty that fate, however cruel, is to be met standing. When spring returned, the ice cracked and drifted out to sea. The water gleamed like steel under the pale sun. Somewhere, in that endless shimmer, the ghosts of ships moved silently toward the horizon, their sails full, their helms steady, vanishing into the mist where all legends go. The empire of the North was gone, but its echo remained, in every wave that breaks against a northern shore. No song rode the wind at Stamford Bridge, only the low, uneasy talk of crows. The grass was matted with frost and blood, the banners of both kings torn and tangled among the dead. A thin mist drifted from the river, softening the edges of steel and bone. The battle was over, but the silence that followed felt older than victory. Men walked among the fallen, searching for faces they knew, names they could return to the living. Among them lay Harold Hardrada, eyes open to the sky he had spent a lifetime chasing. So ended the last great voyage of the North. In Norway, word of the defeat traveled faster than ships. Mothers lit candles for sons who would not return. Poets fell silent. The sea that had once seemed a promise now felt like a grave. For generations, the Northmen had believed that glory lay in the horizon, that a man's worth was measured by how far he dared to sail. But now, the horizon was empty. The world they had discovered was no longer theirs. Across Europe, the name Viking became legend, a word that meant not nation, but memory. The conquerors had been conquered. The gods who had guided them through storm and sword were retreating into myth. Yet even as their temples crumbled, the North refused to forget. In Norway, Denmark, and Sweden, the churches built by kings stood beside burial mounds that no priest dared disturb. Farmers still placed bread for the house spirits and poured ale on the ground for ancestors. Children wore small hammers on strings, hidden under their shirts beside the new cross. The priests preached salvation. The skalds replied with memory. Christianity had won the land, but the heart of the North remained half pagan, half proud, unwilling to let its past die entirely. The poets of Iceland became its guardians. On that remote island of wind and rock, the sagas began to take shape, not as rebellion, but as remembrance. The same voices that once chanted in smoky halls now wrote by lamplight in monasteries, preserving what might otherwise have been lost. They set down in words what had once been spoken to the rhythm of waves and fire, the tales of Odin and Thor, of Loki's cunning, of heroes who crossed the sea to face dragons or kings. Chief among those who gave form to memory was Snorri Sturluson, a man of law and lore. He gathered the songs of centuries into the Edda, recording a world that no longer existed but still lived in language. He described the 9 realms, the making of the world from Ymir's bones, the weaving of fate by the Norns, and the final doom of the gods at Ragnarok. He wrote of it not as prophecy, but as poetry, a vision of a universe that had accepted its own end with dignity. For the new Christian North, these myths were no longer faith but identity. They became the mirror in which a people saw its origins. When monks illuminated manuscripts with crosses, artists carved Thor's hammer beside them. When priests spoke of judgment and redemption, the old songs whispered of courage and fate. The two worlds intertwined, not in harmony, but in coexistence. From that fusion emerged something uniquely northern, a faith tempered by fatalism, a Christianity that could pray with one hand and fight with the other. The North did not surrender its defiance, it baptized it. In England, where the last Norse king had fallen, the legacy of the Vikings endured in subtler ways. The towns they had built, York, Lincoln, Dublin, Waterford, thrived under new rulers. The languages of conqueror and conquered blended into one. Words like sky, window, law, and anger, all Norse gifts, entered the English tongue, reminders that the sea still spoke through them. The very rhythm of English, with its hard consonants and terse poetry, carried the echo of northern waves. Even the Normans who conquered England traced their blood to the fjords. William the Conqueror's ancestors had been Northmen who had settled in the green valleys of France and learned the language of their hosts. In their veins ran the same restlessness that had carried the Vikings to the edge of the world. Thus, when the Normans rode under their banners at Hastings, they were not strangers to the spirit of the sea. They were its heirs. Meanwhile, in Scandinavia, peace took root, fragile but real. Trade replaced plunder. The plough replaced the sword. The kings of Denmark and Norway ruled not by the strength of their fleets, but by their alliances with bishops and nobles. Cities grew from old harbours, Oslo, Roskilde, Uppsala, places once haunted by smoke and oarsong. The world that had begun in wind and fire now found rhythm in the toll of bells. But the old ways lingered in art. Carvers still etched serpents and interlaced beasts into wood and stone, symbols of a cosmology they no longer worshipped but could not forget. The dragon prows of longships became church doorways. The curves of ancient runes inspired the ornament of altars. The North had not abandoned its vision of the sacred. It had merely changed its language. One winter night, in an Icelandic hall, a skald told a story that began with a sea crossing. His audience was not warriors, but farmers, traders, and children. The fire flickered against the carved beams, and outside, the wind howled through the lava fields. Once, he said, the gods lived among us. They sailed the skies and walked the earth. But their time passed, and they went away. Now we live in their shadow, remembering. The children asked if the gods would ever return. The skald smiled. They already have, he said, tapping his chest. They live wherever courage endures. That, perhaps, was the final gift of the Viking Age. Not empire or wealth, but endurance. The North had learned that glory fades, but honor remains. That gods die, but stories outlast them. By the 12th century, the longships were gone. Their fragments slept beneath layers of peat and sand, waiting for archaeologists who had not yet been born. But the songs survived. From them rose an image of the North, not as it was, but as it wished to be, wild, proud, and unbroken. In monasteries, monks copied sagas alongside scriptures. In courts, poets recited tales of Sigurd and Brynhild, as kings listened with tears in their eyes. The North had found its immortality not through conquest, but through memory. Sometimes, at dusk, fishermen on the Danish coast still claimed to hear the beat of oars beneath the waves. Some said it was the wind, others, the ghosts of old voyages returning to the shore. When storms gathered over the sea and lightning split the clouds, the peasants crossed themselves, and then, out of habit, whispered a word to Thor, just in case. The Viking Age had ended, but the world it made endured. It lived in the maps that now stretched beyond Europe, in the languages shaped by its sailors, in the quiet courage of those who faced the sea without illusion. For all their violence, the Vikings had given the world a gift it did not expect, the certainty that no horizon is final. And so, long after their gods had gone to dust and their kingdoms to history, their spirit remained, a flame caught in the wind of time, flickering but unextinguished. The North would never again rule the world, but it would forever remind the world how to face it. By the time the 13th century dawned, the world had forgotten how to fear the North. The dragon heads no longer appeared on the horizon, and the monasteries that once prayed against them now prayed for their souls. In their place came merchants, bishops, and scholars, men who brought parchment instead of swords, letters instead of fire. The saga of the Vikings was finished, but their story had only begun. Chroniclers of the South wrote of them as barbarians who had ravaged civilization, but those who lived among their ruins knew better. The Norse were no longer raiders, but ancestors. The same hands that had burned churches now built cathedrals. The same mouths that had sung of Odin now chanted psalms. History, ever merciless, had turned them from menace to memory. In Iceland, the poets who had once sung for gold now wrote for glory. Their sagas told of men who faced the impossible with quiet resolve. Heroes flawed and mortal, their fates sealed yet unrepented. There was no heaven in these tales, only honor, and no salvation but remembrance. The world had moved on to other empires, yet the Icelanders preserved what others forgot, the dignity of the doomed. They wrote of Egil, who defied kings and gods alike, of Gunnar, who fought his last battle beneath a sky aflame with northern light, of lovers, oaths, and vengeance that outlived flesh. Through them, the pagan world learned how to speak in Christian times. Their characters prayed and sinned, confessed and killed, not to prove virtue, but to affirm existence. For the North, faith was never surrender. It was another way of standing tall before fate. In their sagas, even God seemed to speak in the old tongue. His commandments echoed the same rhythm as the ancient laws. Stand by your word, honor your kin, meet death without fear. The cross might have replaced the hammer, but the soul beneath was still carved from the same wood. As centuries passed, the old gods receded into poetry. Odin became wisdom incarnate, the wanderer who sought truth in sacrifice. Thor became the guardian of the hearth, the strength of common men. Loki, the trickster, remained the shadow of chaos lurking behind all order. They ceased to be worshipped and became symbols, reflections of human nature, written in the language of storm and fire. Runes turned to art, myths turned to metaphor. In carvings and tapestries, the Midgard serpent coiled not as threat, but as ornament. Churches built upon pagan grounds bore dragons in their beams and serpents in their doorways, reminders that creation is born from conflict. Even when the faith of Christ ruled every pulpit, the eye of Odin still watched from the margins of every tale. The North had always believed that the world would end, not in triumph, but in struggle. Ragnarok was not tragedy, but truth, that all things, even gods, must face their twilight. Yet from that twilight came renewal. The Christian world called it resurrection. The Norse had known it as the endless turning of the sea. In that sense, they had never been conquered, only transformed. By the Renaissance, scholars rediscovered the sagas. astonished by their clarity and restraint. Unlike the romances of the South, these tales did not gild their heroes in perfection. They showed men as they were, proud, flawed, and bound by destiny. The North spoke to the modern age before modernity existed, whispering that the measure of greatness lies not in victory, but in endurance. Centuries later, when explorers set sail across new oceans, they carried something of that same defiance. The Vikings had been the first Europeans to cross the Atlantic, the first to stand on the shores of an unseen world. Their footprints in Vinland had faded, but their courage had not. When sailors of later empires faced the unknown, they did so with the memory, if not the name, of those who had gone before. The Enlightenment dismissed their myths as superstition. Romanticism brought them roaring back. Painters filled canvases with longships cutting through storm and fire. Poets dreamed of Valhalla's feasts and Fimbulwinter's frost. The world, weary of reason, turned again to wonder. The Vikings returned not as conquerors, but as symbols of freedom, the eternal wanderers who refused to kneel. In the 19th century, the rediscovery of the Eddas gave Europe back its lost epic. Wagner heard music in their thunder. Sculptors carved gods in marble and bronze. Even as factories rose and machines replaced the ore, people longed for the wildness the North had embodied, the courage to face chaos without despair. The Viking became a mirror for every age that feared it had grown too tame. But behind all the legend and noise, the truth remained quieter and deeper. The real legacy of the North was not conquest or cruelty, but imagination. They had looked into the abyss of existence and told stories that made it bearable. They had taught the world that beauty can live beside brutality, that even the end of all things can be met with song. The sagas endured because they were honest. They did not promise salvation. They promised memory. To be remembered was to live beyond death. To be forgotten was the only true defeat. In that belief, every man was a skald, every woman a keeper of fate. Today, their echoes linger in the bones of language, in the rhythm of stories told by firelight. Every time a ship cuts through fog, every time a traveler faces the unknown with steady breath, the North breathes again. The world no longer prays to its gods, but it still walks in their shadow. On winter nights, the aurora drapes across the sky like the banners of an invisible army. Scientists call it charged particles and light. The old songs called it the gleam of Valkyrie shields. The difference is only language. The wonder remains the same. Somewhere between reason and reverence lies the truth the North always knew, that the universe is vast, terrible, and beautiful, and that to face it unflinching is itself a kind of worship. In a museum in Oslo, a longship rests in silence. Its hull, dark with age, still bears the curve of wind and wave. Tourists pass, whispering as if in a church. Through the glass, they see not wood and iron, but a heartbeat, the echo of men who once believed that no horizon was final. Outside, the sea lies calm, reflecting a sky the color of iron. The ship seems ready, even now, to slip from its cradle and seek the open water. Because the sea never ends. The Viking Age may have closed in battle, but its spirit is immortal. The defiance of the finite, the courage to face oblivion with open eyes. The North taught the world that fate cannot be escaped, but it can be met with dignity. In that, they were never defeated. And when the wind rises over the fjords and the waves darken under the moon, one can almost hear them still. The creak of oars, the crack of sails, the laughter of men who believed that death was not silence but song. Their time has passed. Their story has not.